Happy Tuesday, ladies and gentlemen. It's April 2nd, 2019, and this is your Daily Detroit. I'm Sven Gustafson.
And from our University District studio with a Fago by my side, I'm Jer Stays. Today's episode is all about the Freep Film Festival, which comes to town next week, April 10th through the 14th. This one's a little longer than our usual episodes, but we've got 3 great interviews for you to preview some of what's on offer.
That's right. First up, I speak with J.J. Kramer, co-producer of the documentary Boy Howdy, the Story of Creem Magazine, which kicks off festivities April 10th at the Fillmore Detroit.
Then I speak with Steve Byrne, executive director of the Freep Film Fest. And last but not least, I talk with Jennifer Washington about her film, God Said Give 'Em Drum Machines, the Story of Detroit Techno.
All of that right after this. Daily Detroit is brought to you in part by the Rattlesnake Club, now offering happy hour from 4 to 7 p.m. Tuesday through Friday. Enjoy bites including crispy perch po' boy sliders, flatbread pizza, and baked Virginia oysters, plus daily drink specials.
The Rattlesnake, locally grown, seasonally sourced, and classically inspired since 1988. Go see Chef Jeff and make your reservation at rattlesnakedetroit.com.
J.J. Kramer is co-producer of Boy Howdy, the Story of Creem Magazine, which gets 2 showings during the Freep Film Festival, straight off of its global debut at the South by Southwest Music Festival in Austin, Texas. Jer, I'm personally psyched to see this one, I gotta tell you. JJ is the son of Barry Kramer, who was the founder and publisher of the legendary rock and roll publication, which launched in 1969 in Detroit's Cass Corridor. Here's that interview. JJ, just, to start with, we're talking here on a podcast. Daily Detroit is a digital, media outlet. We tend to have a pretty young and tech-savvy audience. So I thought I'd start by asking you to kind of explain why you wanted to make a documentary about a music print magazine. And, if you could sort of talk a little bit about the kind of the role that it played in the culture of its time.
Sure. Well, we wanted to make a movie about Creem for a number of reasons. So I guess I'll separate them into a couple buckets. For me personally, I'm very much attached to the story because my father was Creem's publisher, so it's something I've had a strong interest in for my entire life. But if we're talking about a broader audience and why it's important to make a film about Creem, it's really about the attitude more than anything. It's that rock and roll, DIY, punk spirit that we wanted to tell a story about. Creem was very iconoclastic in its approach to covering music. They very much had a kill your idols type of perspective. There was nobody that was too good to be knocked off their pedestal, and that included the likes of Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, Lou Reed, and the list goes on and on. Whereas there were a lot of other publications at the time that were much more straight and narrow and afraid to offend and afraid to take a definitive point of view. And we thought it was such an incredible story about the rock and roll spirit that needed to be told. And in addition to that, it's one, a story about rock and roll. 2, it's a story about Detroit. The fact that a magazine like Creem, that at its apex was second in circulation to Rolling Stone, started in Detroit of all places, not on the coasts where most media was centralized. It really spoke again to the Detroit grit, the rolling up your sleeves and doing something on your own terms, and willing something into existence. And that theme in and of itself is something that kind of transcends generations and genres, whether you ever picked up an issue of Creem or not.
The publication launched in 1969, started in, I think, like a house, right, on Cass Avenue, like an upper flat or something like that. Interesting time in the city because it came, 2 years after the uprising, so the city was very much still kind of in tumult and shock from that and everything. What was the magazine like when it first launched?
It was, for lack of a better term, it was a little bit of a mess when it started, but a beautiful mess at that. It was Started in 1969 in the Cass Corridor. My dad actually ran a head shop below where the offices were, and they essentially had an office slash crash pad above that shop where most of the Creem writers would either spend time writing, but a lot of people would end up just sleeping there as well. And at the time, my dad also managed Mitch Ryder and the Detroit Wheels, and their rehearsal space was actually in the offices as well. So if you went up to like the third floor, you had Mitch and Detroit were rehearsing. Then a floor below them, they were trying to write and put out a magazine every month, and also had people trying to get some sleep. So that's why I say it was a little bit of a mess, chaotic, but in the most beautiful way possible.
Creem took as its motto America's only rock and roll magazine, which is a pretty brash statement. How did it sort of fit in with the kind of standard music press in that era? Especially you mentioned Rolling Stone before.
Yeah, so America's only rock and roll magazine was a little bit of an FU to the likes of Rolling Stone. It was meant to reflect how Creem's approach was very, very different than that of its contemporaries. I think you had a lot of magazines that wrote about rock and roll, but you didn't have a lot of magazines that actually lived it. And in many ways, Creem just didn't write about rock and roll bands. They were a rock and roll band that was putting out a magazine. They lived it. They lived the culture. They many times were as dysfunctional and crazy as the bands themselves. In the film, we actually have a number of stories from the former staffers about how they would get into it, about a cover layout, or about whose music was better and why, and nobody wanted to be wrong, and they would always argue about how many angels could stand on the on the end of a pin, sort of thing. They would just get into it over everything because they were so passionate about the music itself, and that's what really set it apart.
Father Barry, you mentioned, the founder and publisher of Creem. He died when you were very young. Do you have any memories of the magazine's like operations, or any of the personalities there, and did you have any involvement with Creem after his death?
I actually have very few memories of my father, which is part of the reason why I got involved with the film. It was a way for me to learn a little bit more about him, about his life, about his legacy. So it's been a real incredible, eye-opening journey for me. As for other memories that I have of the magazine, once my father passed away, he actually left the magazine to me. I was 4.5 years old when he died, and I was chairman of the board of my own rock and roll magazine, which was really fun to talk about at show and tell. So my mom stepped in at that time as publisher with the hope of trying to preserve it until such time as I could step into the role. Unfortunately, that it didn't quite unfold as planned. But over those years, I do remember being in the offices and some of the Creem parties that they used to throw down in Birmingham. I remember being at one specifically when like all the Bad Boys Pistons were there. I remember seeing Isaiah Thomas and Bill Laimbeer, and John Mellencamp was there as well, and it was totally overwhelming for me. And I also remember my mom sending me home very, very early with a babysitter before probably the real party started, which was probably for the best.
Yeah, I'm sure you kind of grew up in a hurry that way, huh?
Yeah, indeed. I definitely, reflecting back on it, had a pretty interesting childhood and a lot of exposure to some really incredible folks and incredible music.
Yeah. The film's directed by Scott Crawford. I know I saw the film Salad Days he did, which is about the 80s punk scene in Washington, D.C. How did the two of you join forces for this?
We were connected through another one of our producers named Jan Uhelski, who is one of Creem's original editors. And they had worked together on some of Scott's other projects. Scott actually had his own music magazine called Harp in the 90s, and he employed a number of old Creem writers. And so Jan and Scott had worked together for a long time and had a long-standing friendship, and she thought that he and I would get along well. And so she connected us, and we hit it off immediately, both aligned on creatively the story that we wanted to tell, and he really has an incredible understanding of the Creem ethos and aesthetic.
Yeah. I imagine you worked with him to help unearth a lot of the archival footage and everything like that?
Oh yeah, yeah. A lot of spending lots of time in my mom's basement, back in Commerce, going through old boxes, looking for photos, finding things that I never knew existed. So that was a really fun, eye-opening part of the process.
Creem, for the most part, stopped publishing in the late 80s. I think they had a brief kind of reprieve in the 90s for a while. So it's been gone for a long time. What do you think the legacy of the publication is today?
I think Creem's legacy is really that rock and roll spirit that I was talking about earlier. It's about if you don't like how someone's doing something, doing it on your own terms. One of the stories that I learned during the making of the documentary was the reason my dad was inspired to start Creem was because he wrote a letter to the editor reviewing, to another publication in Detroit, reviewing a record, and they wouldn't publish it. And so he's like, you know what? I'll do it myself. And to me, that's the impact that Creem still has today. It's really that DIY approach and that irreverent sense of humor and sensibility about not taking anything too seriously, including yourself. That's one other really important point about the magazine is if you flip through the pages, they would very routinely knock artists off their pedestals, and whether that was through a brutally honest review or a funny photo caption that would make fun of certain artists. So you don't really see that anymore today. I think that a lot of media outlets have become a lot more productized and sanitized, and people are afraid to offend anyone. And so when I look back on Creem's run and what its impact is, it's really that. It's about just telling it like it is and not suffering any fools lightly.
Yeah. All right. So JJ, one thing I've always wondered, I'm old enough that I remember Creem. I used to have a stack of issues in my drawer at home when I was in high school and everything. Was the Boy Howdy beer real, or was that just a prop?
We've gotten that question quite a bit. So not to divulge any trade secrets here, but I could tell you that it was not real. There were lots of folks who thought it was real, but it was actually these printed labels that would be wrapped around other cans and used by the photographers. And there were actually a handful of actual aluminum cans that were made with Boy Howdy on them. There was actually a couple interviews, one in particular with Mark Farner from Grand Funk, who brought his can of Boy Howdy to the interview, and it was in like pristine shape. He probably had it for 45 years or so. That was really cool to see. I'm
sure nowadays with the craft beer revolution, I'm sure somebody would jump at the chance to license that and brew it.
Yeah, we're actually having some discussions on that very thing.
Yeah, well, there you go. The Boy Howdy documentary, the Creem documentary, kicks off the Freep Film Festival Wednesday, April 10th at the Fillmore Detroit. JJ, are you going to be there? And if so, what's planned for that event?
Yeah, I am going to be there. We're super excited to be opening the Freep Film Festival and B, to have it at the Fillmore. It's such an iconic venue. So there is a VIP reception that starts at, I believe, 6 or 6:30. I'm not sure that there are any tickets left for that. And then doors open at 7 for people to begin filtering in. And I believe that the actual screening starts at 8 p.m. But to all your listeners, come see this movie. It's a lot of fun. For folks who were there, it's a great walk down memory lane. And for folks that maybe weren't as familiar with Creem, it's this incredible primer that touches on all of like the highlights and the highs and lows, and it certainly doesn't pull any punches either. We set out to tell a warts and all story, and I think that's what we got.
Boy, Howdy, the Story of Creem Magazine. JJ Kramer is co-producer. JJ, thanks so much for talking with us about it. I can't wait to see it.
Next, Steve Byrne wears two hats. He's the arts and entertainment editor for the Detroit Free Press and the executive director of the Freep Film Festival. He joins me on the line. Where did the idea of the Freep Film Festival come from? Because this has grown to be a pretty massive, awesomely massive exercise.
Yeah, so the idea came a couple of us brainstorming around the office, and there were kind of a couple table legs, I like to say, of why we thought it might make sense. One, the Free Press was quite a bit at the forefront across the country, actually, in being a newspaper that was embracing video journalism. We had a crew of photographers, videographers who won a couple of national Emmys. This is going back starting around 10 years ago. And we thought it would be good to have another vehicle to showcase their work rather than just throwing it up on Freep.com. It was worthy of being seen on a big screen. So that was one thing. Around the same time, a lot of people will remember there were a lot of documentary crews coming into town, making films about Detroit. You might remember like Detropia or Searching for Sugar Man or Byrne. And somebody said, why isn't anyone corralling all of these things? They're all coming out at roughly the same time, but you're never getting a chance to see them in the same space. So that was kind of table leg two. And I think the third thing, our corporate parent, Gannett, was increasingly interested in having its media organizations, attempt to be part of the community instead of just always being on kind of the other side of the glass wall and only covering. So this was a way to integrate with the arts and culture scene from my perspective, which is kind of my day job at the Free Press as arts and entertainment editor, a way for us to interact with people rather than just covering them. So those three things came together. There was a lot of, just in transparency, there was a lot of back and forth at the Free Press, whether it was worth us taking on. It took really more than a year for the idea, from the time the idea was pitched until ultimately somebody up high said, yeah, let's give this a whirl. It took more than a year. So, and here we are now, probably roughly 7 years since the idea was first pitched.
What are some of the things that you've learned, when you talk about getting out into the community and doing more things? What are some of the things you've learned in the process of doing that?
Sure. So I would say on a personal level, I've been involved not just at the Free Press, but in previous jobs involved in arts and entertainment coverage, at least, I'm doing some quick math, more than 25 years. And so I thought I knew a lot about what went into creating events, producing events, creating art. And I did find out, that I was lacking a lot of knowledge. So on a personal level, I do feel being involved in the film festival has helped me do my day job better and understand what people on the other side of that glass window are going through, and an attempt to both create events or create actual work. What have we learned about, what has the festival as a whole learned about Detroit? I think there's definitely an appetite for top level film festival being in town. There haven't been a lot over the years that have stuck for a long time. There's one, Cinetopia, of course, that started a little bit before us that has some traction. But say, when you compare Detroit to cities one example that pops to mind is, Cleveland, a somewhat similarly sized Midwestern city. They've had a real outstanding film festival for more than 50 years, I believe now. And of course, Chicago has a really big one. And, Toronto has two monstrous ones. I think there was a hunger for us. There was a hunger for a top flight event. And I don't know that we're totally there yet, but we definitely keep shooting. We shoot high. And I think we've gotten a little closer every year. So I think the market is appreciative. I definitely think, our venue partners, whether it's people like the Detroit Film Theater at the DIA or Cinema Detroit or Third Man Records, the Fillmore, that they're happy that we're trying to be a coalescing force and bringing film and bringing filmmakers, to the people, for lack of a better word. So I think that most people, we're very pleasantly surprised. Most people that we say, hey, here's what we're about. Do you want to play ball with us? The people in town have largely wanted to engage, and that's been super positive, and I'm very appreciative of it.
Yeah, it's been great to see. Why do you think, because Detroit has some amazing art on multiple levels, not just film, but music and, paint, all kinds of things. Why do you think there is that gap? Because I feel like our region should have a lot more and even bigger events. It's one of the reasons why I think like the Freep Festival has a lot of runway to grow.
Sure. We definitely think we have reason to grow. The why, I guess, I would say it's largely inexplicable to me. I don't know the exact answer why that there hasn't been, why a film festival that started in, 1973 isn't in its, 40th year and drawing 75,000 people. I don't know the answer to that. Certainly, as you mentioned, Detroit's cultural history is monstrous, and people look to us around the world, for our music and our art. And certainly there has been a lot of great film that has come out of here as well. I mean, I don't think anyone views this as a film hub necessarily, but I don't think anyone views Cleveland as a film hub either. So, I guess I'm running around the answer a little bit. I don't know the exact answer. There have been other film festivals, in the 90s, and some that still bounce around now. Why they haven't been able to get big time traction, it's difficult to do. I think none of the people involved with Freep Film Festival had a large amount of experience being involved with film festivals before. Several of us had done some volunteering at other festivals, but that was the extent of it. We had a leg up, and I would be the first to say it. The fact that we had a large legacy media organization backing us made it, on one level, made it easier for us, say, compared to somebody who's, at a coffee shop or a bar or just hanging around with friends and saying, let's start a film festival. The Free Press had we had a head start. We were on first base or second base, wherever it was, but it still has not been easy. Film festivals are a very intense experience to create and to program. And so maybe that's the reason. It's not an easy thing to do, would be a way to put it, I guess.
Looking at the lineup, one of the things that strikes me and over the past year is that you've always had a great local focus. Beyond the local focus, what are the kinds of things that you look at for a film for them to be included into this?
Having the Detroit and Michigan element has always been part of the festival because we think it's part of what the Free Press stands for. So we've always viewed the festival as an extension of Free Press journalism. So that's the reason why we've always wanted to have that super strong local string. When it goes beyond that, I would say there's a couple things we look for. One is we do want to, bring top flight documentary filmmaking to Detroit and bring it early, like when films are first in their cycle. So, an example of that I think of, the movie Won't You Be My Neighbor last year, which was the story of Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, if you want to look at it that way. And that was a movie that debuted at Sundance, and then we managed to get it for Freep Film Festival 2018. It had no strong local connection. We just thought it was, one, a great movie and something that our audiences would appreciate seeing. So things like that, we weren't doing that so much in our first and second years, but the last couple of years, we're increasingly just trying to find really great films. Another thing, even if a film is not local, we do think there are some topics of high interest around town that we tend to lean towards, and I think you see it play out in this year's lineup. A few of them that I would mention would be urban issues, sports, music, environment. And so there are several films in the festival that fit all of those categories that may not necessarily be local, but we feel like in Detroit and Michigan, people care about music. And so a great movie about Miles Davis, which is one we have this year called Birth of the Cool. Miles had no particularly strong Detroit connection, of course, with all the great jazz that came out of Detroit. He did play with people from Detroit, but not a Detroit player. But we're like, okay, this movie just played at Sundance. Detroit loves its music. Detroit loves its jazz. This is a movie we want to pursue, and we did manage to snag it, so we're super happy about that. There's some sports movies that would fall in that. We have a sports movie called In Search of Greatness that is, it basically is kind of a philosophical approach to like what makes an athlete great. Is it the way they were reared? Is it the way they were trained? Is it something beyond that? It talks to Jerry Rice, Pele, Wayne Gretzky. Again, it's not a local sports movie, but we do feel sports almost always resonate in Detroit. So hopefully that's not too rambling of an answer to your question.
Oh, it makes perfect sense. If there's one thing I've noticed about this town is that if there's one thing that unites all of this disparate series of towns that is this region, it's the sports teams.
Sure, absolutely. And we do have a couple of movies that are sports oriented that are also strongly local this year. A movie that was produced by the folks over at Fox Sports Detroit. We're going to have the world premiere. It's about the '84 Tigers, of course, the last World Series champion in town. And then probably the other really super notable, strongly local sports movie is called Tough Guy, the Bob Probert story, of course, about the great Red Wing enforcer who did die a tragic young death. So it's a story about Probert on the ice, but also the story of Probert the man, a really strong film.
What are the 2 or 3 things or pro tips you'd give new people who see this and they're like, well, I'm not sure, I haven't heard about this movie, kind of bridge people over? Let's say they're used to going to a big theater. What are a couple pro tips, couple ways that people could get started, or what should they know about this festival?
A couple of things. One is new for us this year. In the past, we've always only sold individual tickets. We do have passes this year for the first time. So if you want to sample and dink and dunk around the lineup, the passes, I think, are, we have 2 festival passes. One is VIP. It's a little more expensive, but the regular one is $175. It would allow you essentially unlimited ability to see everything in the lineup with the exception of a couple marquee events. So I would think about that. I think that on our website, we have several different ways to view the lineup. And it's fairly scannable. One, we have short, like 1 and 2 sentence capsule reviews of every film. We have a searchable grid schedule. Like if you were to say, well, I would like to go to the film festival, but I only want to go to the screenings that, say, for instance, are at Imagine in Royal Oak. You can toggle the schedule so that you would see only the Royal Oak events. Third, we have it as a grid. So if you're like, I only can go on Saturday, so I just want to look and see what's happening Saturday, you could run through that.
That's excellent. And that grid schedule, I found a PDF on the website, and that's something that I'm going to be carrying around because there's going to be times where it's like, I feel like seeing a film, and if there's tickets, then grab them. It just seems like this is going to be a really great event this year, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk today. Our final guest is Jennifer Washington. She's behind the film God Said Give 'Em Drum Machines, the Story of Detroit Techno. The piece explores the story of one of Detroit's great musical additions to global culture. Jennifer, I guess I'll just start with what drew you to techno and the genre in general before we start talking about the film.
So I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. I went to Detroit Public Schools. I grew up in a neighborhood called Green Acres off of 8 Mile in Livernois. And my friends and I, when we, started discovering ourselves and finding out our musical tastes, we discovered a DJ on the radio called Mojo. And he came on every night, and that was kind of our routine. That's what we listened to, and that's kind of how we started getting into the music that we were getting into. But at the time, we called it progressive. So I didn't know anything about techno music. I knew about progressive music that I was hearing on the radio in these mix shows with Mojo. And I knew, then as we grew a little older, we started kind of calling it house music. That's really the music of my teenage years. That was my formative years, and it was such a magical time, and to me that music was magical. And when I used to listen to that music on the radio, it was so inspirational for me. I would make my own tapes, of course. I was recording my own tapes, and I would listen to them every morning before I went to school. I would pretend like I was doing something with my tape recorder and moving the levels every morning, kind of not knowing what I was doing, but pretending like I was doing something important with the music. And I would play it and I would work out because it was my workout music. It would get me up and get me going in the morning. That was kind of like my intro to the songs, but I didn't know who the artists were at the time because Mojo really wouldn't. It wasn't when I was listening. No one, not just Mojo, but any of the mix show DJs, they weren't really promoting the names of the artists or the song titles at the time. So I never knew what they were called or who the artists were or that the music was from Detroit.
And so what moved you from being a fan to being somebody who, starting to put together a movie?
I came home. When I say home, I'm meaning Detroit. I live in Los Angeles now for my high school reunion. I won't say which one, but it was a big one. And so a friend of mine took me to this nondescript building on East Grand Boulevard. I had never been there. I didn't know that it was a business. I didn't know why I was there. He just said, I want to take you and show you. I want to show you something. So there's no sign outside when we get there. I'm not sure it's safe to really enter. That's what it looked like to me on the outside. But when we were let in by some very nice people who introduced us to Exhibit 3000, which is a space that's reserved or dedicated space inside of a distribution company called Submerge. Exhibit 3000 is dedicated to preserving the story of techno's roots being from Detroit, and it's dedicated to the pioneers, Juan Atkins, Derek May, Kevin Saunderson, Santonio Eccles, Blake Baxter, and Eddie Fowlkes, and all the rest of them. There's so many more that I can't say right now, but those cases contained the actual vinyl of my favorite songs when I was growing up, and there were articles proving that these people were from Detroit and they made this music that I had always loved and didn't know much about when I was growing up. So now this is 20 years later, of course. Oh, I said the number, and so and it was just astonishing to me that this music that I always loved was actually from Detroit, and these producers of this music had gone on to become world-class DJs and had been traveling outside the city limits, across the seas, to DJ in clubs all around the world, and they'd been doing it for the past all these years. So when I heard this, I was like, wow, this is I got a chill. And I said, this is amazing. Other people need to know this, not just other people, the world needs to know this. This is a big deal. I knew it was a big deal right away. I ran into another filmmaker friend of mine actually that weekend. He was actually filming some local DJs at local clubs in Detroit for for some time, and that's kind of how it started. And then we realized that the documentary was the way to go. Now, that was back in 2010. This started in 2010. Now we're in 2019.
What are a couple of things that you have learned along the process that you didn't know in this journey?
Okay, first and foremost, I need to say that once I realized that this is an important story to tell, that the world needed to know, when I started doing interviews, it didn't really click at the time that these guys are still living in Detroit and they travel overseas every weekend to DJing places like Ibiza and Berlin and all these places. Like, I couldn't fathom that until I was actually sitting down talking to them in these interviews. And when they were explaining to me that this is what they did, that they had to go outside of the country to make a living, I was like, wow, that's pretty amazing. And at the time, I hadn't really ever been out of the country. And I never thought that I would ever have any business other than travel outside of the country. And so when I heard that they were doing this international business stuff, I was like, well, then if they can do it, then I can do it too. So then I realized that, so then the next thing I know, we were in Amsterdam filming Juan Atkins and Model 500, starting to work on our documentary. And then we were all over the world after that. And so if their story can inspire me like that, then I know their story can inspire others. And so did that answer your question?
Oh, absolutely. One of the things that strikes me talking to you and frankly, talking to a lot of people around creative work in Detroit over the last, year plus that we've done this podcast is it strikes me that so many other places around the world appreciate Detroit's art on a level that sometimes I feel like our own community doesn't appreciate. I can't tell you how many times I've been to events where I know these artists will pull thousands of people somewhere else, but in Detroit, it's a great experience, but you're looking at a room of 30 people. And where do you think the root of that comes from? Is it just that, being a master in somebody else's town? Or, I mean, it always strikes me because that's not unique, I think, to this genre of music. I feel like I see that a lot with creative work in Detroit.
Yes, it's a problem. Other people, and that's something that our film talks about too. That I have seen that in every place that we've been to. First of all, we've been embraced. We kind of, as Detroit filmmakers, we've been embraced. The brand, the Detroit brand and the Detroit music sound brand is embraced all over the world. It's definitely marketable. It's definitely something that I feel like the city needs to be more aware of. That's why I'm doing the work that I'm doing. I'm trying to connect dots because I feel like this, not like you said, it's not just techno. It's this. There's a creative community in Detroit that's very strong, that makes it very special, that makes it very magical, and it would behoove the city and its officials and lawmakers and the businessmen to figure out how to embrace and monetize this thing that and exploit, not in a bad way but in a good way, for the city to become more of a music capital. I feel like Detroit can become like a Nashville.
I mean, we've already got Motown just as even a basic starting point. And then you think about all the other kinds of things that have been from Detroit, including techno, including even things like Eminem and stuff like that. With this, with what you're showing at the Freep Film Festival, what are your next steps? What are you hoping to pull through? Is it going to be the complete film or an early cut, or what's the story with that? I remember that from my notes that is it the complete film or is it like an early cut, or what's the story with that?
So we're going to show Act 1.
Okay.
And it's a great piece and a great foundation. And it talks about what led up to the start of techno in Detroit, and so the types of influences, and it's about the city, and it talks about the different types of musical influence that Detroit is known for and where they came from over time. So it's like a history lesson. It's a steak dinner, I think. I think it's definitely meaty and definitely something that everyone will be able to appreciate, even in that Act 1, just Act 1. I think viewers will come and enjoy it and walk away feeling like they really got something, and they're going to want to see more.
Well, we're going to link to all of that in our show notes. One of the things I want to make sure to have you talk about is that since this is an Act 1, when people go to this to go see this first installment, which I encourage people to do, what are the next steps? Because Act 1 tells me there's going to be an Act 2.
There is an Act 2 and an Act 3, and so we are working on a a feature-length documentary that is scheduled to be completed summer 2019. We are planning to do film festivals as well as music festivals, but film festivals first. And so right now we are just showing pieces in rough cut version. But ultimately we would love to premiere at Toronto or Sundance or one of these bigger festivals so that we can properly bring this to market.
So when and where is your movie showing at the festival?
The Free Press event is on April 13th, Saturday at 8 p.m. at Planet Ant Theater in Hamtramck.
Thanks so much, Jennifer.
For more information and showtimes for all the documentaries showing, visit freepfilmfestival.com. We'll, of course, put a link in the show notes. All right, hope you enjoyed our preview of this year's Freep Film Festival. If you like what we're doing, tell your friends about Daily Detroit. It's the best and easiest way to help us push Detroit's conversation forward.
And if you really want to do us a solid, consider supporting us by becoming a Patreon member at dailydetroit.com/join. You can help us keep fresh episodes like this one coming with as little as $1 a month. I'm Jer Stays.
And I'm Sven Gustafson. Take care of each other, and we'll see you around Detroit.
You're listening to the Podcast Detroit Network. Visit www.podcastdetroit.com for more information.